Hello and welcome to interest.co.nz. I'm Gareth Vaughan with another of our double shot interviews, and I'm joined by Shamubeel Eaqub, who is the principal economist at the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research. Welcome in again, Shamubeel.
Thank you.
Now, you've written a book, Growing Apart, Regional Prosperity in New Zealand. So we're here to talk about the book today, and obviously it comes on the back of an NZIER report on the regional economies as well. So if we just, before we get into the real nitty-gritty and interesting stuff, if we just sort of kick off by just asking you why you've written this book. Where's the impetus for this come from?
Yeah, look, the motivation is very much around, I've been working on regional stuff for the last 3 or 4 years, and every time we do work, it seems like we find these undercurrent, this underbelly of weakness and lack of opportunities in parts of New Zealand. And sometimes the national debate, the national conversation misses some of the nuances that are happening in these small places that don't have a national voice. So the idea of this book was to really kind of give a voice to some of that lack of opportunity, especially for young people, but also to kind of describe why some of these tensions are pushing some of these regional economies into this fairly weak positions, and what can we do? I don't give any easy answers because I don't think there are any. It's a very complex situation. I've tried to tell the story in the book with some empathy because I think we need to be able to really do something, because it feels like there are people in parts of New Zealand that are getting trapped in poverty, and that's not right. That's not what New Zealand is about.
Now, you've talked about, there's some fascinating insights in the book, and there's a few quotes that I sort of picked out. I just thought I'd just throw one at you to begin with. You've said, some regions now represent a burning platform requiring urgent attention. Which ones, and why do they need this attention?
Yeah, so, when we looked at some of these regions, it became very clear that they seem to be stuck in this paradigm of weak growth, weak population, poverty. And the ones that really stand out are places like Northland, Gisborne, Manawatu, Wanganui, where economic opportunities just don't seem to be there for the people who are there. This is not a criticism of the places themselves. It's a whole bunch of these big forces that are really being quite caustic and destructive for these economies. And it sort of really backs up what we see in the deprivation indices, for example, by Otago, where we see these real pockets of poverty and deprivation across New Zealand. And really that's why we're saying that current policy is not doing enough. And that's the burning platform that if we do change, we can make a real difference in people's lives.
We do hear, though, of some provinces doing well. I mean, we hear about Taranaki with their oil and gas and their dairy, and Southland with their dairy. I mean, comparatively, are some provinces doing reasonably well?
Oh, absolutely. There is heaps of prosperity around New Zealand, and in many ways, that's what's driving the difference. There are some places that are doing really well, but there are others that are stagnant or falling behind. And we need to focus on the places that are falling behind. Yes, we should absolutely celebrate the successes, but the failures or the weaknesses that we have in our economy, the places that are trapping people in poverty, if we can improve those, if we can change those, imagine the difference it makes even to one person's life.
You've also made the point that the fact remains young people are leaving our provinces. I mean, but hasn't that always been the case in New Zealand, certainly in New Zealand's modern history?
It's been the story over the last century. Urbanization and young people moving on for newer adventures and opportunities is absolutely something that has been happening forever. But it also means that populations in many small towns are getting older and smaller. And this matters particularly for local governments, where they are having to replace and renew assets that are very expensive, but their rating base, both in terms of incomes and populations, are going backwards. So it creates this massive disparity between what we expect from our regions and the services that we expect in our region versus what's possible with who's left and how much income we earn.
You have really highlighted the ageing population in some of these regions too. Another really interesting point that you raised in the book, 23 territorial authorities have age dependency ratios, which is the number of over 65s relative to working age people, that are higher than Japan, which of course is the country with the oldest population in the world. So there's some pretty serious implications there around healthcare, superannuation. So, I mean, can you give us an example of some of these territorial authorities that have a really significant ageing population? Which ones are most affected by this?
Yeah, so the aging one is really interesting. It can either be your comparative advantage, as it is for places like Bay of Plenty. They're doing really well on the back of an aging population, becoming the center of attraction. And there are other places like Gisborne, which is also aging quite quickly, but also because of its weak economy, it makes it very difficult. In the last census, we saw that in Gisborne, the biggest area of growth was people living alone. The number of families actually going backwards. So this aging story is becoming quite prominent and quite a important driver. But as people age, you've got fewer people who are entrepreneurs and workers. But it also means that you've got a lot of people who are income poor but asset rich. Which makes it very difficult, again, for local governments to increase rates and spend. So there's so many examples right around New Zealand of these territorial authorities, and it's really about having that conversation about what is it that we want from these places, what does success look like, and how do we manage it without making undue demands of our citizens.
And you've also suggested that immigration can help resolve some of these issues. Saying, for example, we need to seriously consider reducing the impact of ageing with immigration by bringing young people to New Zealand, and also handled with care, immigration's benefits should significantly outweigh any stress placed on social cohesion. So, are you advocating changes to how we run immigration policy to help fill some gaps around the country by bringing in young people?
Immigration is a very sensitive topic. Even though it's in the very fabric of our history, immigration is a very difficult thing for us to talk about. In part because I think we haven't had an honest debate about how much population do we want. Do we want to be a small country or a big country? I don't think we've decided. But nevertheless, I look at examples of places like Southland where they had this intense need for workers, but they could not get it at home. And they relied on immigration, and that has been a really positive outcome. But we also know that Southland is a very homogeneous community, and bringing in a lot of people who are different, who look different, have different cultural preferences and all those kinds of things means that there is a risk that you create this rift within the community. So what we're saying is with immigration, it's not just about getting the people in. You got to get them in, you got to give them jobs, but also integrate into the community where you can. Because even though assimilation can have quite negative connotations, ultimately if you don't preserve that social fabric, that's really what New Zealand is built on, this trust amongst our people, trust amongst the community. And it feels to me like immigration can be a good thing, but only if handled with a lot of care and done right.
Another factor, I guess, that we're looking at in New Zealand more and more now is the ongoing growth of Auckland, in stark comparison to most of the rest of New Zealand in terms of population and obviously jobs, etc., here in Auckland. You've made the point, though, that if we stifle growth in Auckland, it won't turn up in Northland, it'll turn up in Sydney or Singapore. Obviously that reflects the very global world we live in today. But is it not a bit of a concern that if we just let Auckland continue to grow and grow, that it's actually a risk for New Zealand? If we had some horrific sort of Christchurch earthquake type event in Auckland, obviously on top of the terrible human cost, the impact on the economy would be massive. So should we also be looking to perhaps incentivise businesses to set up in other parts of New Zealand?
Everything that we find with Auckland is it's actually a very different economy for the rest of New Zealand. It is very complex. It has jobs and it does things that nobody else does. And because it's got scale and it's got complexity and all of those kinds of things. So you're absolutely right that there is a huge amount of concentration risk, as all big metropolitan centres do. But in New Zealand, in all honesty, we can only really have one until we have a much bigger population. So from that perspective, the real story is about unshackling growth in Auckland, making it as flexible and nimble as possible so that we can grow and it becomes the urban playground of New Zealand, that we have those sparks of innovation flying. All the agglomeration stories that we hear about of big cities. Auckland is going to be that big thing for New Zealand. It doesn't mean other places can't benefit. I look at the benefit that Hamilton, Waikato gets from the rise of Auckland. Absolutely clear that it is benefiting. So we can have a whole bunch of second-tier cities that can also be playing very strong supporting roles. But not everyone can be Auckland, and we shouldn't pretend that is the case. So my sort of view is that it's very much about letting Auckland succeed because it's competing in a different plane. And a lot of the interventions and policies that are required to help give people opportunities are actually different in the provinces from what's happening in Auckland.
You've also made the point that the declining regions will present some of the hardest questions of all. Is the decline irreversible? And if it is, do we need a strategy to wind down affected industries in areas with dignity and certainty? Has it got to the point where we perhaps do need to shut up shop on some places?
Yeah, and I think that's been the thing that everybody's picked up on the back of this book. I sort of made the comment about zombie towns. There's only a handful of them, but they're sort of going along with very little certainty on what is it that they want to be. We've got small towns around New Zealand that have large infrastructure, but declining populations and aging populations and very little income and employment opportunities. What is the strategy for that? I'm not sure we have a strategy to wind down places. Even though when we look through history, I think we do. I think that we need to be serious that in some places it might be better to merge or move people to somewhere else or give them an option to live without some of the very expensive infrastructure and services that we have become used to.
Would you name any of those places?
Well, I can't think of any that I want to name because I'll never be able to go to the town again. But I sort of compare when we go to holiday houses like in places like Pohara where my sister has a house, it doesn't have reticulated water. But it's still a great place to visit and a great place to live for some people. And I think it's about making sure the options are there for the community to choose, but don't burden them with expectations and standards that don't work for that particular community.
Okay, now you've said in the book that you really want to encourage discussion and debate about these issues, and that's one of the key reasons you've written it. You do have a couple of key messages: enabling mobility and accepting that some places can't continue in their current makeup. So we've certainly discussed the latter one. But in terms of enabling mobility, how do we do that?
So, what we see in some places is, yes, young people leaving, but the young ones that are left behind quite often don't have good education, don't have good employment income prospects. So, the things that seem to be big issues here are education outcomes need to be much better in some of those smaller regions. We need to make sure that people who are not able to get jobs in those places have the ability and the wherewithal to move to places where there are jobs. It can be very difficult. You can't go from, say, Northland to Auckland without some significant financial costs in terms of transport and housing costs. So being aware of that and enabling people to sort of engage in that is really, really important. And in some ways, if they leave home, it means that those regions are going to get smaller. So it has some costs and benefits, but ultimately we have to boil it down to, are we giving the same kind of opportunities to all New Zealanders, regardless of where you live or where you're born? And I think that's that equality of opportunity that's really, really important.
And how do we tackle these issues, I guess, from a policy perspective? We've obviously got local governments all around the country. We've got a national government as well. Whose job should this be?
I think it's a job of everyone. In some ways, the community is too apathetic. Civil engagement in local government is very, very low, less than 50% turnout in the last election. Local governments can have a very big influence in generating the conversation and the discussion with central government, departments and politicians. We're not doing enough of that. Central government already spends huge amounts of money on welfare, education, health, justice. But quite often they're done at a very national level, as you should for a country of 4.5 million people. But when we look at the weaknesses in certain geographies, it suggests to me that we need more focus in certain places. Maybe we need to spend more effort on education and welfare in places like Northland, where we are not seeing the same kind of outcomes we're seeing in places like Auckland or Wellington.
Now, you've got 3 recommendations and 5 steps in the end of the book. What would you like to see happen as a result of your book?
If everybody's made it to the last chapter, I hope the first thing that they do is you actually have a conversation about the widening gaps between New Zealand's regions. I think it's very uncomfortable to talk about poverty because it is an uncomfortable truth. New Zealand has poverty, particularly in child poverty, which has lifelong consequences. So very much the message for me is have a read of the narrative, because it's about creating empathy for our regions that are not sharing in the opportunities of all of New Zealand. And I think we need to see a big shift in mindset to say that, yes, we're in it together, and we need to have a change in mindset and policy making to get a better outcome for all New Zealanders.
Well, thanks a lot for that, Shamubeel. That's Shamubeel Eaqub, the Principal Economist of the New Zealand Institute for Economic Research, and I'm Gareth Vaughan at interest.co.nz.